welcome back to my garden. It's a little earlier in the week than usual, but I watched a fascinating short documentary on YouTube, and it sort of got the cogs whirring in my brain, and well, I couldn't help myself, so here we are. The video in question was about a story of it's a true story of a youngish, I suppose, in his 30s, gentleman who kind of packed it all in and went off to live in the wilds and make a go of things. Well, that's always a fairly interesting story that catches my attention, because it sort of resonates somewhat, but more of that later. Also, it featured high in my feed. Algorithm spat it out because the film was by none other than Mark Manson. Now, you may well have heard of Mark Manson. In the unlikely event that you haven't, he came to prominence with a multi-million selling New York Times bestseller. It really was a bestseller. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. He was a blogger who eventually wrote a book. And the book in question is sort of life philosophy. Not just sensationalist. I mean, there's some very interesting ideas. It's well worth a read. In discussions with my brother, I think we both reached, well, my brother doesn't like it in the slightest. And I understand why. And I think we both agree that very often the stylistic choices that he makes, they're motivated by the bottom line and perhaps not creating something of real lasting quality. Yeah, he's a sensationalist. He panders to a market that thinks it's cool to swear a lot. And fair enough, Anyway, I'm digressing, and this isn't yet. This isn't about Mark Manson yet. It's about Brent Underwood. And who is Brent Underwood? Well, he was a chap, I suppose, in his middling 30s in America who cashed in all his life savings and did an incredible thing with his life. And the short video is kind of the story of that. It kind of gives the outline and then draws conclusions, and there's interviews. It's a terrific little documentary, I thought. So Brent Underwood cashed in his life savings and bought a ghost town in the Sierra Nevada desert hills of California, abandoned ghost town, mining town. I think it's called Cerro Gordo, Fat Hills, or Fat Mountain. And he ended up living there. At first he was kind of commuting, and then he ended up living there full time, sort of kicked in with the COVID lockdown. And his story is very, very interesting, and he's the insights into the town and the insights into kind of digging deep into yourself, finding inner resources, which living on your own in the middle of absolute nowhere would do. And Manson sort of cleverly ties this in with things like fairly obvious Henry David Thoreau on Walden Pond. Henry David Thoreau, again, if you're not familiar with him, sort of late 19th century, I suppose middle-class chap who went to live in a shack in the woods. Famous quote, which I'm not even going to try to remember, but he's the guy who said something about most men lead lives of quiet desperation and go to their grave without singing the song in their heart. Something like that. And he went to sing the song in his heart, and he went to live in this shack in the woods and be one with nature, and very naturalistic philosophy. Interesting stuff. And Manson also ties this in with the myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus, Kierkegaard's philosophy, and the idea, and this is kind of why I thought this will really dovetail in with the videos I've made recently, the idea of finding meaning in your life, and how do we do that? And Camus' idea that, well, there is intrinsically no meaning, so we have to construct it. And perhaps that is the origin of organized religion, and not simply revealed truth by a divinity. Anyway, it was a very, very interesting video, and it caught my attention and resonated, as I say, with me, because it seems to me I haven't done anything quite as dramatic as that. I haven't gone to live out in the middle of nowhere in desert hills, an abandoned mine. And sure, I moved from a big metropolis to a rural village, but we're anything but remote. We're a 100-kilometer bus ride from a state capital. And there are people in my village, and I see them every day, and there are people in an art community that I connect with, and all of that sort of good stuff. So I am not living in isolation. Well, of course not. I'm married as well. And this chap certainly didn't seem to have anyone else living with him in this abandoned town. He had goats and chickens for company. He tells a story in the film where at a certain point his friends started to worry when they were having conversations with him, and he was talking about his companions, Jekyll, was it Jekyll and Hyde? It might have been. But they turn out to be crows. And that's when people started to worry. And so I watched this video and thought about it a lot. And this idea of finding meaning in your life through an absurd quest. In Brent Underwood's case, the quest to revitalize, to rebuild an abandoned town. And it's a life mission. And I found that fascinating. And he tells many interesting stories, and he really has dug into the history and also the sort of science behind late 19th century silver mining. So there we are. Before making this my film, I thought, well, for once I'd do a little bit of research. And I checked up the name, which I'd forgotten, Brent Underwood. And boy, oh boy, was I in for a surprise. Now, the surprise isn't that this is all, a fictional story, that Mark Manson made it all up. Because he didn't. And indeed, everything that he'd said in the video seemed to be true. Except context is everything. Narrative leads you in fascinating directions, and we don't realize the conclusions that we draw. But very often, the little slice we are given helps us form an opinion that is far removed from maybe how things really are. So, in the case of Brent Underwood, First of all, a little backstory. He did a couple of degrees, he worked for a while as an investment banker, and that didn't, this is all Wikipedia, by the way, that didn't surprise me, because if he cashed in his life savings, I don't know how much an abandoned ghost town would cost, but it wouldn't be cheap. So I'd figured he was kind of in tech or banking or something like that, so that he'd have had enough money. And I guess when he did this, he must have been about mid-30s, let's say. But after investment banking, he had a number of business interests, and one of them, and his last, was running an exceptionally successful hostel. He'd done some backpacking in Central and South America, come back to America, found himself to the USA, started a backpacking hostel in Texas, or a guest house or something like that. It was very successful. And when he cashed his chips in, he didn't do it alone. The Wikipedia article talks about a business partner, John, and other investors who are close personal friends. And yes, he did stay there for, certainly in COVID, it sounds like he stayed there for, at one point, 10 weeks without seeing a soul. But for the most time, there were regular visitors, and they weren't just your ordinary regular visitors. They included the actor Jeff Goldblum, for example. There was a hotel that very sadly burnt down an electrical related fire, they suspect. And in the Manson film, you get the feeling that he was sort of like a historian, painstakingly restoring something to former glory. No, it was a functioning hotel. People would come and stay in it. This wasn't just someone going out to find themselves in the woods like Henry David Thoreau. This was a business decision, albeit a business decision which forced Brent to live on his own for long periods of time. So there we are. It didn't make me feel like I'd been conned, but the first thing that struck me as I read this Wikipedia page is, there I was when I was watching the film thinking, wow, this I can connect with, because it's kind of like, well, my story, just much more extreme. Except maybe not. Not my story at all. He'd gone out to find himself, and he's written some very interesting articles on Medium. He has a book, lessons he learned from living in or building rebuilding a ghost town, or whatever it's called. New York Times bestseller. Would you believe it? But it's in a way, it's a more extreme place than the place that I've come to live in. But it's a far less radical departure from the life he was leading before. And it did, once I kind of came to terms with that sort of question, it did make me think a little bit. There was no mention in the film about any of these other details. It really, the documentary had been edited in such a way to make you feel like someone had decided, I need to find myself, I'm going to go out into the wilderness. And the documentary had been edited, and it began with Manson posing the question that, most young men dream of going out into the wilderness to find themselves. And it's not exactly the case in point here with Brent Underwood. He'd gone out somewhere because it was an extraordinary thing to do, And yes, the level of commitment is exceptional, but also because he saw it as, at first, an exciting business adventure, and then he was all in because of COVID. And even that, the timing, at the time that he went to stay in this abandoned ghost town, his hostel business is sort of all but collapsed because of the lockdown. So what to make of all of that? I think the big takeaway for me is that what you see is not really the full picture. And it was just yet another reminder of how, I suppose, social media, YouTube, this new technological virtual world we're living in, grotesquely misrepresents reality, and leaves us sometimes thinking we're falling short in some sort of way. And I don't feel that, I don't feel like, my life is a flop. I'm incredibly blessed, as I often say, and I'm grateful, and I'm also aware that Rita and I are having fantastic accomplishments and doing a wonderful thing. But sometimes it does feel like a little thing, and it isn't. This film made me think how many of the big things that we see are actually distorted for impact. And so really we just need to turn off the media and focus on our own personal journey. So there we are, a bit over time, but never mind. This is what it is. And as always, I'd love to hear your comments, and I trust your lives are filled with joy and are measuring up to your own goals and desires, and not being driven by other people's standards and sometimes fantasies. So that's it. Until next week, from sunny Brazil, ciao.